Relative clauses. Here are some questions which hopefully you will be able to answer by the end of this lesson. Number 1, can relative clauses be used alone? Number 2, how are relative clauses often introduced? 3, what is a defining relative clause? And 4, what is a non-defining relative clause? So, relative clauses add essential or additional information to a noun or a pronoun. A relative clause must always be attached to a main clause, so it can't be used alone. Relative clauses are often introduced by a relative pronoun. Here's an example. My friend who lives in China is visiting us next week. This sentence has 2 clauses, a main clause and a relative clause. The relative clause starts with the relative pronoun who. The relative clause is underlined. Who lives in China? The rest of the sentence is the main clause. Relative clauses are either defining or non-defining. Defining relative clauses are essential to understanding the noun. So we need this relative clause to properly understand the noun. The example from before is a defining relative clause. Who lives in China helps the person identify the noun. It helps them understand which friend. Defining relative clauses don't use any commas. Non-defining relative clauses are not essential to understanding the sentence. They add additional information. Here's an example. Exercise, which I hate, is good for you. So here, the relative clause, which I hate, is additional or extra information. If we remove that, we can still understand the noun, exercise. Exercise is good for you. Non-defining relative clauses do use commas. So in this example, the non-defining relative clause is in the middle of the main clause. So there is a comma either side. The non-defining relative clause can also be at the end of a sentence, like in this example. We went to France, which is where we met. We went to France, which is where we met. Now this is a non-defining relative clause because you could simply say we went to France and the noun France is understood. Which is where we met is extra information, and it comes after a comma. We don't always have to use a relative pronoun. If the relative pronoun that introduces the relative clause, if it's the same as the object of the main clause, we can leave it out. So this example, we went to France. The subject is we, the verb is went, and France is the object. In the non-defining relative clause, which refers to France. France is where we met. So in this case, we can leave which out. So it becomes we went to France, where we met. When the relative pronoun is the same as the subject of the main clause, we can't leave it out. So for example, exercise, which I hate, is good for you. The main clause is exercise is good for you. In this clause, exercise is the subject, and in the relative clause, which refers to that subject. So we cannot leave it out. We can't say exercise I hate is good for you. That's not grammatically correct. So let's go back to those questions that I asked at the beginning. Number 1 was, can relative clauses be used alone? And the answer to that is no, they can't. They must be used with a main clause. Number 2 asked, how are relative clauses often introduced? And that's with a relative pronoun, but as we've just seen, not always. Number 3 asked, what is a defining relative clause? And a defining relative clause is a clause that identifies the noun. It's essential to the understanding. And number 4 asked, what is a non-defining relative clause? And a non-defining relative clause is a clause that adds information, additional or extra information to the noun.